So we're going to investigate now more into the Bible and what the Spirit of Prophecy says, this time about where Jesus was crucified. As we know, when Ron Wyatt claimed the discovery of the Ark of the Covenant, he said that it was discovered below the site of the crucifixion of Jesus. And so, if we can identify from the Bible and the Spirit of Prophecy where Jesus was crucified, that would add weight to the claim as to where the Ark of the Covenant is located. There are really only two options when you look at the site of the crucifixion of Jesus. One is on Mount Moriah and the other is on Mount Zion. Okay, here's the one on Mount Moriah. There's a feature of a skull face that appears in the cliff face of this site here, and the site is called the Garden Tomb. That's on Mount Moriah. And here's the one on Mount Zion. It's actually a Catholic church, and it's called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So you can see all the Catholic idols and the icons there, and the sunburst in the floor. And actually, if you visit there, it's the most magnificent display of idols and icons and all the Catholic things that would go with a magnificent Catholic church. As I say, the one on Mount Zion is the Catholic site, and it was chosen by Constantine's wife. That was back around the 4th century AD. Obviously she wasn't an archaeologist or a scholar or anything like that. She was just the emperor's wife at the time, and she decided, well, this is the place where Jesus was crucified. She decided that about 300 years after the event. Now, I'm not going to get into the history and who is Constantine and who is his wife and how did she come to that conclusion, or anything about the geography or any of those things. I promise to stick to the Bible and the Spirit of Prophecy in this series, so that's what I'll do. And I'll go straight to the Bible. Desire of Ages, page 829. What she says here, what Ellen White says, is that Jesus was crucified on Mount Moriah. As usual, Ellen White takes away all the speculation and all the conspiracy and so forth, and she just tells you straight what the answer is. She says, as the place of his ascension, Jesus chose the spot so often hallowed by his presence while he dwelt among men. Of course, there she's talking about the Mount of Olives. Okay, so Jesus ascended from the Mount of Olives. Let's start again. As the place of his ascension, Jesus chose the spot so often hallowed by his presence while he dwelt among men. Not Mount Zion, the place of David's city. Not Mount Moriah, the temple site, was to be thus honoured. There, Christ had been mocked and rejected. There, the waves of mercy, still returning in a stronger tide of love, had been beaten back by hearts as hard as rock. So in the second part of that paragraph there, she says that on Mount Moriah is where Christ had been mocked and rejected, and where the waves of mercy, returning in a stronger tide of love, had been beaten back by hearts as hard as rock. So there she's saying, she's describing the crucifixion, of course, and she's saying that it happened on Mount Moriah. So immediately we can write off the Catholic Church, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on Mount Zion, and we know that he was crucified on Mount Moriah. And as we said, there's actually only one candidate excuse me, there's only one candidate for Mount Moriah, and that is the Garden Tomb. We know also that Calvary was outside the city walls. It was just outside of Jerusalem. And indeed the Garden Tomb is also just outside the city walls. So Calvary was on Mount Moriah, outside the city walls and at the place of the skull. Okay, there's that skull face again. And this is the Garden Tomb, as we said. This is where Ron Wyatt dug, and where he claims that he found the cross hole of Jesus Christ, and the Ark of the Covenant directly underneath it. So really, that should be an open and shut case. However, you might be surprised to learn that some or most of the Adventist scholars actually believe that Jesus was crucified on the site on Mount Zion, the Catholic Church site, the church that's called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, I was surprised to find this out because I thought Ellen White was very clear. So I emailed, well, the most prominent one that I know. He is a professor of biblical archaeology, and he's head of the department at the well-known Adventist institute. The reason I'm being candid about him is because when I emailed him, I asked him if I could mention his name in connection with his belief, that he believes Jesus was crucified on Mount Zion. And he declined that invitation. For some reason, he didn't want his name to be identified with this belief on this particular video anyway. And there's another Adventist pastor actually that has released a series of videos at the moment and claims the same thing. And I emailed him asking him if I could put his name to his belief that Jesus was crucified on Mount Zion. And he didn't reply, so I didn't really get his permission either. So for some reason, at least these two experts are being rather candid about putting their name to this belief. I don't know why. Perhaps you'll work it out for yourself when we see their belief. This is what the belief is, basically. Let's zoom in on this map a little bit more. Okay. You can see here two mountains in the picture. It's a topographical map of Jerusalem. Can you see the faint city walls? They're rather faint. They're the same colour as the background, but you can see the one going across the screen at the top. That's the north wall, okay, where Damascus Gate is. Okay, so on the right you have Mount Moriah, and on the left you have Mount Zion, and the red line is going, the solid red line is going from the Temple Mount on Mount Moriah over to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on Mount Zion. Okay, what he's saying in his email, which is on the left, is that if you walk that red line, you avoid going down into that valley which you see. That valley separates the two mountains. Okay, he admits that that valley is there obviously, and that it does separate the two mountains, but he says that if you walk that red line, you avoid that valley and you only go down a little valley, a little dip, and then you only go back up a little uphill slope, and therefore he's saying it's the same mountain. Okay, I can't really explain it any better than that. It doesn't make a lot of logical sense to me, so I'm having trouble making it logical. But he's basically saying if you avoid going all the way down that big valley and all the way back up the other side, that would identify as two different mountains. And he's saying if you walk around the edge, then it's a curving ridge and it's the same mountain. What you would in fact have to do, if you can see the city wall line, I'm not sure if you can, I'll try and point it out here, but if you can, here's the city wall, the north city wall. Okay, so you can see that if you walk this red line, which he's suggesting, you have to leave the city wall at this point, you have to leave Jerusalem and then come back in somewhere. If there's a gate there or not, you'd have to come back in, and then you'd be on the Holy Sepulchre. So you're avoiding this valley. This valley makes it clearly two distinct mountains. Okay, but by going here, you only go down a little dip here, and then go back uphill a bit there, and then you're on Mount Zion. And he's suggesting that because of that, that's the same mountain. The problem with that is, of course, the Bible identifies Jerusalem being built on two different mountains. The Bible all the way through identifies Mount Moriah and Mount Zion. Unfortunately, I have to say, no matter how qualified or professorly you are, you're making of none effect the spirit of prophecy if you do believe that. Okay, I'm just going to read the email to you. This is the exact word for word email which this gentleman wrote. Just basically so you know I'm not making it up or making it sound any more silly than he made it. Just to make sure I'm representing him accurately, he says, note the red line. It could be argued that there is a secondary knoll or peak to the west, but they are still part of the same curving ridge. So he's talking about the secondary knoll being Mount Zion to the west, and then he's saying they're part of the same curving ridge. As you walk north of the Temple Mount, the ground gradually rises. There's a dip or two that was man-made, moats, to protect the Temple Mount. This makes Moriah appear to stand as a separate rise, not dramatic. So he's saying that Mount Moriah appears to be a separate mountain. There is also a valley between the Temple Mount and the western part of the old city where the Holy Sepulchre Church stands. So he's admitting, obviously, the valley that separates the two mountains. Yet if you walk north of Temple Mount, so now he's going to describe the route that is marked out by the solid red line. Okay, I'll let you see that solid red line while I read. Yet, if you walk north of Temple Mount, you go slightly uphill. Then you turn left or west, still going slightly uphill. You pass by a human quarry that makes a north-south break between the rise. Then you turn left again, south to the Holy Sepulchre. Okay. You are essentially walking on a curving ridge. Geologically, this is part of the same feature or range. Actually, all the high points can be argued to be part of a small mountain range. A single mountain can have several peaks. So this particular expert, Adventist expert, despite Ellen White saying that Mount Zion is separate and distinct from Mount Moriah, and that Mount Zion has David's city and Mount Moriah is the place of the crucifixion, he's saying that that's not necessarily true, and they could be two mountains. To me, that's making of none effect the spirit of prophecy, but I'll let you decide what you make of that. Anyway, the garden tomb is on Mount Moriah. Ellen White says Jesus was crucified on Mount Moriah. And here's a picture of the late Ron Wyatt digging on Mount Moriah at the garden tomb. It's the only candidate for the site of the crucifixion on Mount Moriah. And that's where he says he found the cross hole of Christ, and directly beneath it, the Ark of the Covenant.